the 24th of July, 2024. A factory floor in West Brisbane. The 80,000th truck rolls off the line, 300 tonnes, 685 horsepower. The bulldog snarls on the bonnet. The engine block underneath was made in Sweden. This is not a story about a factory closing. The Wacol plant is alive. 3,000 trucks a year. 700 Australian workers. The bulldog still on every bonnet. This is the story of how an Australian icon can die while its factory thrives. In March 2000, Mack Trucks Australia hit 14.3% of the Australian heavy-duty market, the all-time peak. 10 months later, AB Volvo paid $1.8 billion for the Mack Corporation. 2 years after that, the Australian Mack Veet was globally dead. The bulldog still snarls. The bark behind it is Swedish. Chapter 1. The Bulldog Lands. December 1941, Sydney Harbour. The first American troop ships were docking in the panicked weeks after Pearl Harbor. Crates the size of cattle yards, stencilled with United States Quartermaster Corps numbers, came down the gangways onto the wharves. Inside the crates were tens of thousands of tons of American steel and a chrome dog welded to the bonnet of every fifth chassis. The Americans had brought their trucks with them. The bulldog had already arrived in Australia 22 years earlier. In 1919, the Vacuum Oil Company of Sydney bought 2 AC model Mack tankers to replace 4 horse-drawn carts. They ran on Sydney roads for 33 years. But the bulldog did not enter Australian working memory in 1919. It entered with the Pacific War. Over the course of the conflict, more than 1,000 military Macks landed in Australia under United States Lend-Lease. The heavy NR6x4 was the most common, a 5-ton prime mover the Quartermaster Corps had ordered by the tens of thousands for global service. Other variants, the NM, the NO, the EH, arrived in smaller numbers. The NO was the 6x6 prime mover designed to tow the 155mm Long Tom artillery piece, and 2,053 of them were built between 1940 and 1945. By 1943, when there were 150,000 American servicemen on Australian soil, the Mack Bulldog snarling out of a brown chassis was the sound of American industrial muscle on Australian roads. The Australian Army adapted them. The 6th, 7th and 9th Divisions in the Middle East had already been running British and American trucks across the desert at the Siege of Tobruk from the 10th of April to the 7th of December 1941, under Lieutenant General Leslie Morsehead, the men who became the Rats of Tobruk. The Mack NO and the LMSW 6x4 were among the trucks that hauled the heavy artillery up to the wire. This chapter requires a confession. The Australian War Memorial holds clear photographs of Australian Army Macks from the 1980s onwards, the locally built MC3. The genuine Middle Eastern Mack photographs from 1941 and 42 are scarcer in the public catalogue. The AIF Australian Army Service Corps war diaries that would name specific drivers have not been digitised in full. We flag that. But what is documented is what arrived on Australian docks between 1942 and 45, and what stayed behind when the Americans went home. When the Yanks went home in 1945, they left their Macks behind. Chapter 2. The Disposal Era, 1946. Holding yards in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Townsville and Darwin, row after row of olive drab chassis sat in the sun. The white American serial numbers faded on the door cards. The chrome bulldogs still snarled on the bonnets that had carried artillery up to Tobruk and supplies down the Burma Road. The Commonwealth Disposals Commission had been established in 1944 to sell the staggering tonnage of military equipment about to flood the Australian market. Owner-drivers, transport pioneers and cattle station men walked through those yards with cash. They walked out with the chassis that built the post-war Australian transport industry. The most famous of them was a man named Kurt Johansson. Born on the 11th of January 1915 on Deepwell Station in the Northern Territory, Kurt Johansson had grown up watching pastoralists lose half their herds on the long drove south. After the war, with a £2,000 interest-free loan from a pastoralist who wanted his cattle moving faster, Johansson built the world's first commercial road train. He called it Bertha. We need to flag this honestly. Bertha was not a Mack. Bertha was a surplus Diamond T model 980 prime mover pulling 23 ex-military gun trailers, and she now sits in the National Road Transport Hall of Fame in Alice Springs. But the pattern, the surplus military vehicle that became the foundation of an outback transport empire, is the exact pattern that built Mack's Australian dominance over the next 30 years. The named Mack pioneer of the disposal era was a Northern Territory operator called Noel Buntine. Buntine bought his first Mack, a B61, in 1956. He named it the High and the Mighty. It was the founding truck of Buntine Roadways, the cattle haulage empire that would dominate the top end for the next 4 decades. The original B61 was until recently displayed at the Queensland Heavy Transport Museum at Gatton. The B61 changed everything. Northern Territory road train operators using slow British trucks were averaging 27 kilometres per hour on dirt. The Mack B61 doubled that to 55. A cattle run from Wave Hill to Adelaide that had taken 3 weeks now took 8 days. The outback became Mack country. The B61 was not just a truck. It was the chassis on which the post-war Australian outback economy rebuilt itself. By 1963, Mack Trucks Australia was open for business at Archerfield Aerodrome. Remember that name, Archerfield. We will return to it at the end of this story. Chapter 3. Archerfield to Richlands, 1963. 3 wartime hangars at Archerfield Aerodrome on the southern fringe of Brisbane. The hangars had been built by the Royal Australian Air Force in 1940. The United States 5th Air Force had serviced its B-17s here during the Pacific War under the command of General George Kenny. 21 years later, an Australian engineer named John Anderson walked into those same hangars and set up the first Mack Trucks Australia assembly line, where General Kenny's bombers had been serviced. Mack Trucks Australia Proprietary Limited was established that year as a joint venture between Anderson's Group and Mack Trucks Incorporated of Allentown, Pennsylvania. The Australian arm would import partially assembled chassis from the United States, build them up locally, and sell them through a dealer network across Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and the Northern Territory. In 1972, a Swedish company called Volvo separately set up its own truck assembly plant 10 kilometres west of Archerfield, in the Brisbane suburb of Wacol. A $2 million facility, Volvo's second largest truck plant anywhere outside Sweden. The 2 factories, one American and one Swedish, sat 10 minutes drive apart for the next 29 years. Remember Wacol too. We will come back to it. In 1973, a 23-year-old Brisbane engineer named Don Hoey walked through the Archerfield gates for his first day. He carried a clipboard and a slide rule. He had no idea he was about to spend the next 43 years of his life designing every flagship Australian Mack and watching foreign owners absorb every one of them. Hoey's first major project was the locally built RW700 RSX Superliner. The American Superliner had launched in 1977. The first Australian-built unit, fitted with a 450 horsepower Caterpillar 3408 V8, was delivered to Cleary Brothers at Port Kembla in early 1979. Its first job was hauling low loaders up the gruelling Mount Owsley Pass, the steepest stretch of National Highway in New South Wales, 12 kilometres of climb, 1 in 9 in places, the kind of slope that boiled radiators on lesser trucks. 6 months later, in July 1979, the fourth Australian superliner went to a Victorian tanker operator called Bromage. It was the first Australian superliner fitted with Mack's own 16.4-litre V8. The drivers called it the Big Bopper. That truck still exists. Remember it. In 1981, Mack Australia moved out of the wartime hangars and into purpose-built premises at Richlands, West Brisbane, 3 kilometres east of Volvo's Wacol plant, paint booth, heavy frame jig, cab trim line, parts logistics warehouse twice the size of Archerfield. By 1994, the Richlands floor was building 852 Macks a year. Don Hoey had been there for 21 years. Chapter 4. The Bop-bop-bop. You cannot tell the Mack story without telling the V8 story. The Mack EM9, later EA9, 16.4-litre V8 was the loudest, the loneliest and the most distinctive heavy truck engine ever sold in Australia. The exhaust note, a low syncopated bop-bop-bop, was the result of an unusual firing order across 8 large-bore cylinders. Drivers swore you could hear it from the next station over. At idle, it sounded like a slow heartbeat. At full noise on a Pilbara haul, it sounded like the ground was complaining. There was nothing else on the road like it. In 1988, Australia's bicentennial year, Mack Australia released a limited series called the Superliner 2 Bicentennial, 16 trucks, each named for an Australian explorer or folk hero: Ned Kelly, Captain James Cook, Captain William Bligh, Ludwig Leichhardt, Sir Charles Kingsford Smith, the Reverend John Flynn. 500 horsepower V8s, chromed badging, bought by owner-drivers who wanted to put a piece of national mythology on the bonnet of their own rig. The V8 culture was not advertising. It was real. April 1994. Tanamai Track, 4 in the morning. A Northern Territory cattle driver named Plugger Bowden coupled 29 stock trailers behind a 1988 Mack Superliner with the 500 horsepower V8. He drove them 439.169 metres into Bourke, New South Wales. Guinness World Record. The trailers stretched almost half a kilometre. Bowden had been driving Macks for 2 decades. He chose the Superliner because the V8 had the bottom end torque to start the load rolling without slipping a clutch. Bowden's record-holding Superliner has since been restored and lives in Toowoomba. 12 years later, on the 18th of February 2006, another driver named John Atkinson coupled 113 trailers, read that again, 113, behind a Mack Titan at Clifton, Queensland, 1,474.3 metres, the world record for a single prime mover. It still stands. This is what the Bulldog meant in Australia. Not the marketing copy, the cattle, the records, the shake of the ground at 4 in the morning, and in Paris, in a Renault boardroom, a Frenchman called Louis Schweitzer was already buying shares. Chapter 5. The Cost of the V8. Here is what the bicentennial trucks did not show you. The Richlands floor in the 1980s and 90s was not a museum. It was a working factory on a tight margin. In a market the V8 was beginning to lose. The world's other heavy truck makers, Cummins in the United States, Caterpillar, Detroit Diesel, had moved to inline-6 turbo diesels years earlier. Fewer cylinders, less heat, lower fuel burn, easier to service. The V8 was a romance. The balance sheet was a different document. Don Hoey's engineering team kept the V8 competitive year after year. They re-rated the EM9 from 400 to 450 to 500 to 560 horsepower. They tightened the emissions. They built the locally designed value liner around it. They built the cruise liner around it. They kept the bop-bop-bop alive. The Richlands floor was hard. The summers were brutal. The packing and trimming lines ran long shifts in the Brisbane subtropical heat. The workforce, by the 1980s, was substantially migrant, post-war Greek and Italian families that had come through Bonegilla and settled in Inala and Acacia Ridge, then Vietnamese arrivals through the late 1970s. We flag that the injury records from the Richlands floor across those decades are partial in the public archive. What is documented is the pattern described in the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union Queensland branch submissions across heavy vehicle plants in that period: long shifts, repetitive strain, engine line heat exposure, and the competition was closing in. International Harvester ACCO at Dandenong, covered in another Lost Legacy episode, was Mack's direct Australian-built heavy truck rival. Kenworth at Bayswater was the perennial leader. The Australian heavy truck market was a three-way knife fight. The Veet was Mack's signature. By 1998, it was also Mack's vulnerability. Every other heavy truck maker in the world had moved on. The Veet was charisma. The Veet was the bop-bop-bop. The Veet was the sound that sold a superliner to an owner-driver who could have bought a cheaper Kenworth. The balance sheet was about to find a buyer. If you want to keep these memories alive, click the link below in the description and reserve a copy of the book. Chapter 6. The Number That Killed Them. March 2000. Allentown, Pennsylvania. A wire copy goes out to the trade press. Mack Trucks Australia has hit 14.3% of the Australian heavy-duty truck market. Read that again, 14.3%, up from 11.9% the year before. Mack was the second best-selling heavy truck in Australia, behind only Kenworth, on a continent that runs on prime movers. The announcement came directly from Mack's global president and chief executive, a Frenchman named Michel Gigoux. His words to investors: Mack's Australian subsidiary captured a 14.3% share of the Australian heavy-duty truck market. This compared to an 11.9% share in 1999. It was the highest market share Mack Australia had ever recorded. It would also be the last time the brand cleared 10%. The mining superlative was real, but it needs to be drawn carefully. Pilbara in-pit iron ore haulage, the giant 300-ton dumpers running at Mount Newman, Tom Price and Marandu, was not Mack territory. That was Caterpillar 793 and Komatsu off-highway territory, and it still is. We flag that. The Mack mining domain was on-highway road train bulk haulage and mine site logistics, the haul from the lease boundary to the railhead, the supply runs into the camp, the dust corridors that connected the Pilbara mines to Port Hedland and Dampier, the Great Northern Highway, the Goldfields Highway, the Stewart, the Barclay, the Buchanan. Every one of those roads had a Mack on it before sunrise. In those corridors, Mack was king. The B61 had cemented dominance in the 1950s. The R model carried it through the 1970s. The Superliner and the Titan owned it through the 80s and 90s. A Pilbara contractor who needed to move bulk cement, fuel, ammonium nitrate or graded ore across the red ground bought a Mack first and asked questions later. The chrome bulldog on a road train was as common as the saltbush on the side of the highway. In Kalgoorlie, in 2002, a man called Murray Leahy was about to register a company called MLG Oz. Leahy had left school at 14. He had spent the next 22 years driving and operating trucks and earth-moving equipment across the Western Australian goldfields. His first contract was hauling silica for BHP. We will come back to him in Chapter 10. Mack hit 14.3% in March 2000. 10 months later, it did not own itself anymore. Read that again. 10 months between the all-time peak and the foreign absorption. 10 months. Chapter 7. The Slow Swallow. The takeover did not happen overnight. It took 22 years, and it happened in 2 acts, both by coincidence or by pattern, on the second day of a month. Act 1, the 2nd of October 1990, Paris. In 1979, a French state-owned car company called Renault had bought 10% of Mack Trucks Incorporated, Renault had no truck business of comparable scale. It wanted a foothold in the North American heavy truck market, and Mack, which was losing money, was vulnerable to a quiet equity drip. By 1982, Renault had 20%. By the mid-1980s, around 40%. In 1987, the conglomerate restructured. The truck and bus division was spun out into a subsidiary called Renault Véhicules Industriels, RV1, and the Mack shareholding went with it. RVY was now chaired by a man named Louis Schweitzer. In September 1990, Schweitzer pulled the trigger. BAI launched a tender offer for the remaining publicly traded Mack shares at $6 and 25 cents per share. On the 2nd of October 1990, RV1 announced it had won control of 93.1% of Mack by the 9 o'clock deadline on the 28th of September. The Baltimore Sun called the bid controversial. The United Auto Workers, which represented Mack's hourly United States workforce, watched and said nothing public. Mack was now a wholly owned subsidiary of a French state-influenced industrial concern, the brand that had been American since John Mack built his first bus in Brooklyn in 1900. As of the 2nd of October 1990, the Bulldog answered to Paris. Act 2, the 2nd of January 2001. Gothenburg, 11 years and 3 months later, on the 2nd of January 2001, AB Volvo formally implemented its acquisition of Renault Véhicules Industriels, and with it, Mack. The United States Department of Justice had characterized the deal in its December 2000 approval as Volvo's proposed $1.8 billion acquisition of Renault Véhicules. Renault took 15% of AB Volvo in return. The combined entity became the world's second largest heavy truck maker, behind only Daimler Chrysler. Both takeovers on the 2nd of a month. Read that again. Both takeovers on the 2nd of a month. The Volvo chief executive who signed the second deal was a Gothenburg-born engineer named Leif Johansson, born on the 30th of August, 1951. Volvo's chief since 1997. 21 months earlier, in March 1999, he had sold Volvo cars to Ford for $6.4 billion United States dollars to refocus Volvo on trucks. He had cashed in cars. Now he had bought Mack. His statement on the day was this: Mack is one of the world's strongest brands in the industry, and it has its own production of engines, which was a very important factor for us. We intend to achieve further critical mass in the engine sector. He did not say he was buying Mack to keep Mack alive. He did not say he was buying Mack to preserve the Bulldog. He did not say he was buying Mack for its Australian factory, its drivers, its dealers, its mining customers. He said he was buying Mack for the engines, to consolidate them. In Brisbane, Don Hoey read the wire copy and went back to the drawing board. Chapter 8. The V8 falls silent. The Australian Mack EA9 V8, the 16.4-litre engine that had carried the Super Liner 2, the bicentennial trucks, Plugger Bowden's record road train into Bourke, had already been quietly shelved in Australia. The decision was made before the Volvo deal closed. In 1999, the Australian Mack V8, by then rated at 610 horsepower, was discontinued. The flagship Australian Superliner was re-engined with a 600 horsepower Cummins 15-litre signature. The bop-bop-bop stopped in Brisbane. The new Cummins was lighter, cleaner, easier to service, and returned better fuel economy. It did not sound like a Mack V8 because it was not a Mack V8. Drivers who had spent 20 years tuning their ears to the syncopated bark of the EM9 walked into the dealership in 1999 and walked out with something quieter than they remembered. In January 2001, the Volvo deal closed. Within the year, Mack assembly was transferred from Richlands to Volvo's Wacol plant, 3 kilometres west. The two factories had been 10 minutes drive apart for 29 years. Now they were one factory. Don Hoey's words on the day in the Trailer magazine retrospective years later were these. Arguably, the biggest change in Mack's history came in 2001 when the company was purchased by Volvo. Mack Assembly was subsequently transferred to Volvo's production facility at Wacol. That is the most cinematic understatement in Australian heavy truck history. 2 years later, in 2003, Volvo dropped the Mack V8 globally. The engine that had defined the American Bulldog since 1962 was gone. The Volvo D16 family and later the MP series became the new Mack drivetrain. From 2008, every Mack rolling off the Wacol line ran a Volvo-derived MP8, MP10 or MP11 engine block, designed in Sweden and assembled in Hagerstown, Maryland. We need to flag two things honestly here. First, Mack engines were always built in the United States, at the Hagerstown plant in Maryland. The Australian factory had always done chassis design, cab engineering and final assembly. The Mack V8 was never cast in Brisbane. The genuine Australian loss was the locally calibrated V8 specification and the locally designed model lines, the value liner, the cruise liner, the Australian superliner, not an Australian engine foundry. Second, the Metro liner survives. The Australian-designed Mack Metro liner, Don Hoey's 1990 vocational truck, is still in production today, still Cummins-powered, still finding mining and concrete customers. Ostmix took 21 of them in 2023 and ordered another 10 for 2024. Not every Australian Mack design was extinguished. The flagship was. But the silence is real. Listen for the bop-bop-bop on any Australian highway in 2026. You will not hear it. The Mack V8 has been gone from new Australian trucks for 26 years. The drivers who knew the sound are getting older. The owner-drivers who put their savings into a bicentennial superliner in 1988 are now in their 70s. When they go, the sound goes with them. The dog still snarled on the bonnet. The bark behind it was Swedish. Chapter 9. The Quiet Erasure. Between 2001 and 2017, the Australian Mack identity was disassembled one component at a time. In 2001, assembly moved to Wacol. In 2003, the global V8 died. In 2008, the Volvo MP engine family replaced the last of the Mack-branded drivetrains. The Australian-designed cruise liner was discontinued. The value liner had already been phased out in the early 1990s for the CHR-CLR series. The Trident, launched in 1998, was Don Hoey's last clean-sheet Australian flagship. By 2017, Don Hoey was 67 years old, and he was retiring. He had been there for the first Cleary Brothers superliner in 1979. He had been there for the Bramage Big Bopper in July of the same year, the first Australian V8. He had been there for the bicentennial trucks in 1988, for the Plugger Bowden record in 1994, for the Trident in 1998, for the Volvo takeover in 2001, for the V8 burial in 2003, and for the MP series transition in 2008. What he said, on his way out the door in 2017, was this: I lived the dream and loved everything I did. We flag here that Don Hoey has never gone on the public record lamenting the loss of Australian engineering autonomy. His published interviews are uniformly neutral in tone. He is a working engineer who watched his life's work absorbed and did not say a word against the people who absorbed it. The silence does the work, the sentence does not. We have seen this pattern before. Lost Legacy has covered Peter's Ice Cream, where the Mulgrave factory survived under Froneri ownership, but the Australian Peters dynasty died. The same logic. The factory lives. The identity does not. The freezer at the servo still says Peters on the door. The boardroom that decides what goes in the freezer is in London. The factory that decides what goes on the Mack chassis is in Gothenburg. The pattern repeats. We have covered International Harvester ACO at Dandenong, Mack's direct Australian-built heavy truck rival, now folded into Iveco with around 5% of the Australian heavy-duty market. Two Australian-built heavy truck brands that both peaked in the 1990s. Both absorbed by European conglomerates. Both still wearing American or Australian heritage badges. Neither one Australian in any meaningful engineering sense. And we have not yet covered the Clayton plant in Melbourne, where Volkswagen, Nissan and Volvo cars and light trucks were assembled between 1972 and 1988. That site was demolished in 2024 to make way for a data centre. Foreign capital does not always preserve the factory. Sometimes it knocks it down. Wacol is still standing. So far. 6 years after Don Hoey retired, Volvo Group Australia sent a Scottish ex-apprentice mechanic to Brisbane to celebrate a milestone. Chapter 10. The 80th truck. The 24th of July, 2024. The Wacol assembly line. The 80th Wacol-built truck rolled off the line. A Mack Titan, 300 tonnes gross combination mass rating. 685 horsepower. A Volvo MP10 engine block designed in Sweden, assembled in Hagerstown, Maryland, shipped to Brisbane and lowered into a chassis built by Australian workers. 80th. The highest production milestone in the history of Mack's Australian operations. The customer was MLG Oz Limited, the same Murray Leahy company we left in Chapter 6. MLG had grown from a single silica contract for BHP in 2002 to an Australian Securities Exchange listing in 2021, raising $70.7 million at $1 per share, closing 30% up on debut. MLG's fleet by 2024 was 140 heavy prime movers, more than half wearing the Bulldog. Murray Leahy, on the record, the Mack brand has played a key part in keeping our wheels turning over the last decade, a testament to the local knowledge, skill and dedication of the engineers at Wacol. The ceremonial handover happened 2 months later, on the 25th of September 2024, at MLG's Paddington site in Kalgoorlie. The man speaking for Volvo Group Australia was the company's president and chief executive, a Scotsman named Martin Merrick. Merrick had joined the Volvo Group in 1988 as an apprentice truck mechanic in Scotland. He had risen through senior vice president roles in Sweden, running global retail development for Volvo Trucks. He had been president of Volvo Group Australia since the 1st of September 2018. Flying in alongside him from Pennsylvania was Richard Millian, Mack Trucks USA's Senior Vice President of Strategy and Development. His statement on the day of the handover was this: "World-class manufacturing is alive and well here in Australia, and I'm extremely proud to see this Mack Titan delivered to such a valued business partner." Read that again. The 80th Mack truck, the highest production milestone in Mack Australia's history, was celebrated by a Scottish executive of a Swedish company, with an American Mack executive flown in from Pennsylvania, and delivered to a Western Australian mining contractor whose dealer was about to be acquired by the same Swedish parent. Read that again, because here is the bitter arithmetic underneath the ceremony. Mack's share of the Australian heavy-duty truck market has fallen from 14.3% in the year 2000 to 6th place in 2025, around 5%, behind Kenworth, Volvo itself, Isuzu, Scania and DAF. Mack sold 959 heavy-duty units in 2024, around 726 in 2025, in a market that contracted 16.7%. The Volvo Group's combined Volvo plus Mack plus UD block, what the trade press calls the king of the corporates, moves between 26 and 28% of Australian heavy-duty trucks. The Bulldog accounts for less than a quarter of that block. On the 1st of July 2025, Volvo Group Australia completed the acquisition of Trucks Centre, WA, 8 branches across Western Australia, the dominant Mack dealer in the state for over 30 years, the dealer who had sold Murray Leahy his first Titan back in 2014. Vertical integration. The Bulldog now sells through a Swedish-owned dealer network. The independent Mack distribution chain in Western Australia, built over decades by Australian dealer principals, is gone. From 2027, the Wacol line will start building electric Volvo FH, FM and FMX prime movers, alongside, but not instead of, the Mack range. There is one place left to go, not the factory, not Wacol. 10 kilometres east, back to where it all started, Chapter 11, the Wacol plant and the hangar. Stand at the corner of Wacol Station Road and Boundary Road, Brisbane, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in late 2026. The factory is alive. The Wacol gates hum. 700 plus workers come in on the shift roster. 120 Australian suppliers feed components in through the loading bays. 3,000 trucks a year roll out, somewhere between 50 and 60 units a week, under Australian-made certification. This is the only plant on Earth where Volvo and Mack come down the same assembly line. The Bulldog still snarls on every Mack bonnet that rolls off. But the cab 2 stations down the line is a Volvo FH, and the engine block being lowered into the next Mack Titan was designed in Gothenburg and shipped from Hagerstown. The Australian-made sticker is genuine. The Australian engineering autonomy that produced the V8, the Superliner, the Value Liner, the Cruise Liner and the Trident is gone. The line is louder than ever. The V8 sound has been silent for 26 years. Now drive 10 kilometres east to Archerfield Aerodrome. In May 2019, 100 years after the first 2 Macks landed in Sydney, Don Hoey and a small group of retired Mack Trucks Australia employees set up a pop-up museum inside one of the original wartime hangars. The same hangars where General Kenny's B-17 aircraft had been serviced in 1942. The same hangars where Mack Trucks Australia had started in 1963. The same hangars where Don Hoey had walked in for his first day, in his 23-year-old skin, in 1973. A 1924 AB, a restored R model, a bicentennial Superliner, a Plugger Bowden tribute panel. The Bramage Big Bopper on display next to a photograph of its July 1979 delivery. The Heritage Collection sits in the hangar where the company was born, kept alive by the men who built it, not by the Swedish company that now owns the badge, not by the Scottish executive who celebrated the 80,000th, by Don Hoey and his retired engineers on volunteer time in a hangar 3 kilometres east of the factory that is no longer theirs. The wheel turned. The factory moved west. The man returned east to where he had started. Lesson 1. The buyer arrives at the peak. Mack hit 14.3% of the Australian heavy-duty truck market in March 2000. It was the highest the brand ever climbed. 10 months later, on January 2, 2001, Volvo paid $1.8 billion for the parent corporation. The pattern repeats across every Lost Legacy episode. Foreign capital does not rescue struggling Australian icons. It buys them at the peak, when the brand equity is highest and the financial leverage is greatest. Then it consolidates. Renault took 22 years to swallow Mack outright. Volvo took 11 months from the Mack peak to the signature. Lesson 2. The badge outlives the engine. The Australian Mack died on the day the Voit went silent. The bop-bop-bop that defined the Stuart Highway, the Tarnami, the Marble Bar Road and every cattle run from the top end to the Riverland, gone in 1999. Replaced first by a Cummins, then by a Volvo MP block, the Chrome Bulldog still snarls on the bonnet, but the bark behind it is Swedish. This is what identity death looks like in heavy industry, not a closed factory. A factory that builds the same shape with someone else's mechanical voice inside it. The customer cannot tell the difference at the dealership. The driver can tell the difference the first time he starts it. Lesson 3. The factory that lives belongs to someone else. Wacol builds more trucks than the Richlands floor ever did. 852 at the 1994 Richlands peak, around 3,000 a year at Wacol today. The 80,000th truck was built in July 2024. The line will start producing electric Volvos from 2027. The plant is alive. But every decision about what those trucks contain, every engine specification, every chassis tolerance, every cab platform, every dealer acquisition, every emission certification is now made in Gothenburg, 10,000 kilometres from the Brisbane River. Listen for the bop-bop-bop on the next stretch of highway you drive. You will not hear it, not from any Mack rolling off the Wacol line in 2026. The 16.4-litre V8 that defined the Australian outback, silent in Brisbane since 1999, dead globally since 2003, exists now only on YouTube footage of 1980s superliners, on the hangar floor at Archerfield, and at heritage truck shows where retired owner-drivers in flannelette shirts crank their old EM9s over for a crowd that remembers what an Australian Mack used to sound like. This is not just the story of Mack Trucks Australia. It is the story of what happens when the badge outlives the engine, when the factory is louder than ever. But the country it was built in no longer decides what comes out of it. The Mack Bulldog still snarls. The Bourke is Swedish. The factory is alive. The icon is dead.